stands in the dim light of the barn. The walls pulse as if alive, drenched in blood. Flesh peels from the bodies hung on meat hooks, their once human forms now mere husks. Around a massive table, the cult gathers, laughing, their mouths glistening with the remains of the night's final meal. The bones of Father Joseph, the revered priest of the town, sit like a centerpiece. His eyes were removed long ago, and his skull now a grotesque chalice passed from hand to hand. Elias, trembling, holds the carved thigh of Abigail, the mayor's daughter. He looks down at the bite marks covering the still warm meat. The cult leader, Miriam, watches him with a cold grin, urging him to take the bite that will finalize his initiation. His heart pounds, the sound of his blood deafening, but he lifts the flesh to his lips. Hours before the feast, Elias is thrown to the floor of the chapel, his face smeared with blood. The cult circles him, their feet tapping rhythmically on the stone. They chant, a slow, agonizing hum that reverberates in his bones. Father Joseph's lifeless body lies before the altar, his chest cavity torn open, organs carefully removed and placed in a silver bowl. Miriam, dressed in her ceremonial robes, slowly dips her hand into the priest's chest. Blood trickles down her wrist as she marks Elias's forehead, muttering ancient words that have been passed down through centuries. This baptism was the final step before the feast, where he would become part of the old ways, where flesh is not just consumed, but worshipped. The barn is unnervingly silent, save for the muffled sobs of the captives tied to the posts. Their screams had long since faded, their voices stolen by fear. The cult prepares for the evening's events with surgical precision. Limbs are dismembered, tendons are snapped, and yet there is no sound from the victims. They have accepted their fate, or perhaps the horror has robbed them of all ability to react. Elias watches as Miriam carves symbols into Abigail's stomach, her skin opening like parchment beneath a blade. Abigail, once full of life, now looks to Elias with hollow eyes. There's a faint understanding between them. She knows he will eat her tonight, and somehow, in that shared realization, there is a twisted intimacy. Elias begins to weep, but it is too late for remorse. The ritual must be completed. The revelation. Miriam had known from the moment Elias arrived in the village that he was special. She saw the hunger in his eyes, the yearning for something primal, something that lay beyond civilization's rules. She fed him stories, tales of ancient gods who demanded blood, who gave power in exchange for sacrifice. It was not long before Elias found himself participating in the cult's secret gatherings. What began as small, unsettling rituals, the burning of offerings, the carving of sigils into his own skin, escalated. Soon, Elias was witness to something far more disturbing. He saw them feed for the first time. The villagers, once pious and moral, tearing apart a prisoner like wild beasts. The crunch of bone, the spray of blood, the sound of teeth gnashing against sinew. He recoiled in horror, but Miriam's voice whispered in his ear, "You'll understand soon. You'll feel the power in the flesh." Months before, the mayor's daughter, Abigail, went missing. The town descended into chaos, searching for her in every crevice, but she was never found. At least, not alive. Elias had known where she was all along. Miriam had taken her, not for ransom, not for cruelty, but for the ritual that would mark her transformation from human to offering. Elias watched as the cult prepared Abigail. She was not to be killed quickly. No, the ritual demanded prolonged suffering. For days she was starved, her limbs gradually removed with painstaking care. First a finger, then an ear, then an arm. Her flesh was salted, her mind slowly crumbling into madness as the pain became her only reality. And then, when her spirit was sufficiently broken, the feast began. Elias did not think he would enjoy it, the act of consuming another human, but the first taste was like fire in his veins. He bit into the seared flesh of a captive, a man who had come to the village seeking shelter from the winter storms. The man's eyes stared lifelessly at him from the corner of the room as Elias chewed, the meat rich and tender. Miriam's voice echoed in his mind. "You are becoming one of us, Elias. The hunger will grow." And it did. The hunger consumed him, driving him to madness. He began to crave the taste of flesh, the feeling of power that came with each bite. It wasn't just the nourishment. It was the belief that by consuming the body, he was absorbing the soul, the strength, the life force of the person. Elias stands before the village, covered in blood, holding the final piece of Abigail's flesh. The villagers surround him, their faces a mixture of horror and confusion. They had no idea what had been happening beneath their feet, in the barn, in the chapel. The cult had been a secret for centuries, its rituals passed down from generation to generation, hidden beneath the guise of religion. But now the truth is out. The villagers scream and flee, but there is no escape. The cult is everywhere. The mayor's house, the blacksmith's forge, the tavern, all of them had been part of it. And now, with the final sacrifice made, the ritual is complete. The ancient gods awaken, their hunger sated for now, but soon they will demand more. Elias watches as the ground begins to tremble, the earth splitting open to reveal a gaping maw beneath the village. The cult stands at the edge, their eyes glazed over, their mouths frothing. One by one they leap into the darkness, their bodies swallowed by the ancient gods below. Elias feels the pull, the hunger inside him growing stronger. He takes one final look at the village before stepping forward, into the abyss. The diary in his hand falls to the ground, blood-soaked and unread. Epilogue. Miriam's diary, entry 57, the ritual is complete. Elias was the final piece. I knew he would succumb, but I didn't expect him to enjoy it so much. He was more than a participant. He was the chosen one, the one who would bring about the end. Entry 58. The village is gone now, devoured as was foretold. The gods are pleased. The hunger will return, but not for many years. For now, we rest. But when the time comes again, we will be ready. Entry 59. I see Elias in my dreams. He is with them now, with the gods, he is one of them, and soon I will join him. The village of Cold Hollow was never found again. The land swallowed it whole, leaving nothing but whispers in the wind of a place where gods once feasted on flesh. The awakening. The silence after the ritual is deafening. Miriam's diary sits in the middle of the abandoned barn, the air thick with decay. Suddenly the earth begins to rumble once more. The gods, thought to have returned to their slumber, are stirring. From beneath the ground a low growl echoes, but it's not the gods. It's something far worse, something older. In the shadows, a figure emerges. Abigail. Her skin is reformed, her eyes glowing with a fiery intensity. She walks with unnatural grace, her body no longer human. Her lips curl into a smile as she retrieves the blood-soaked diary from the floor. With a voice that is no longer her own, she speaks. Elias thought he was the chosen one, but they chose me. The diary bursts into flames in her hand, the pages disintegrating into ash. As the ground splits open beneath her, Abigail is lifted by unseen forces. She is no longer the victim, no longer the sacrifice. She is the vessel. The gods had deceived them all, Miriam, Elias, and the cult. The last sentence of Miriam's diary flickers in the air like a dying ember. They lied. With a sudden flash of light, the entire barn collapses, but Abigail remains, floating above the rubble. The gods had never intended to rest. They had planned this all along. Abigail was their true avatar, the one destined to bring about a new era of terror. But just as she ascends, a voice calls out from the abyss below, a voice familiar yet terrifying. It's Elias, his voice twisted, no longer his own. You thought you were chosen, Abigail. But I am the key. The ground splits once again, and Elias's twisted, grotesque form emerges from the earth, covered in blood and dark sigils. His eyes glow with the same unholy fire, and as the two stare each other down, the world begins to unravel around them. The sky darkens, the village collapsing into nothingness. Their confrontation is inevitable. One will consume the other, and whoever remains will unleash a terror that humanity has never known. And then, silence. Elliot had never thought he'd see his life change in such a strange way. It started with a whisper, a faint, almost inaudible voice calling his name. As he looked around his apartment, his skin prickled. He was alone, or at least he thought he was. One night, as he sat in his living room, he saw a woman standing in his kitchen, staring out the window. Her figure was hazy, as though she were fading in and out of reality. Elliot rubbed his eyes, but she didn't vanish. "Hello?" he called, voice trembling. She turned slowly, her eyes filled with a sorrow he couldn't place. "Can you hear me?" she whispered, her voice carrying a distant echo. "Yes," he answered cautiously. "I can hear you." She looked surprised, almost relieved, and simply nodded before fading away into nothingness. Elliot thought he was going mad. The appearances of people, or were they spirits, became more frequent. They always seemed lost, confused, sometimes surprised that he could see them at all. His life had turned into a bizarre series of encounters with these figures, who all seemed to wander aimlessly, searching for something just out of reach. He began speaking to them, learning snippets of their stories. One was a young boy who looked at Elliot in shock, asking if he was a ghost too. Another was an elderly man who said he was looking for his wife, who had left him behind. Elliot offered sympathy, but every conversation left him more unsettled. The living world began to feel distant. His friends' voices grew muffled, the city's colors dulled, and he felt detached from everything he'd once known. But he didn't dwell on it. He was preoccupied with the spirits, determined to help them understand why they were trapped. One afternoon, he met a stranger in the park, a wiry man with a weathered face and an old-fashioned coat. "You're one of them, aren't you?" the stranger asked. Elliot froze. "One of who?" The man narrowed his eyes, the ones that walk in circles stuck in between. "You think you're alive, don't you?" Elliot scoffed, laughing it off, but the stranger's words gnawed at him. The spirits he'd seen. Had they mistaken him for something else? "You're not listening," the man continued. "You can see them because you're one of them. Ask yourself, when was the last time someone actually looked at you?" The stranger's words haunted Elliot, and he decided to test them. At the cafe he frequented, he sat directly in front of the cashier, yet she didn't acknowledge him. He went to his office, watching as co-workers bustled around him, not sparing him a single glance. His heart sank as he walked through the city. Nobody looked at him, nobody noticed him. He thought back to that day, the day he had moved into his apartment and realized he couldn't remember arriving. It was as if he'd been there forever, and the strangers he'd encountered, the spirits, they hadn't looked through him. They'd looked at him, with the same haunting confusion he felt now. Elliot's mind raced, piecing together the terrible truth. He was one of them. He had never been helping lost souls. He was a lost soul. His world fell silent as the realization took hold, the city around him growing even more distant, almost like an old memory. In the reflection of a store window, he saw himself, pale and faint, as though he were fading. "I'm one of you," he whispered to the next ghost he encountered, a young girl who smiled sadly and took his hand. She didn't speak, only nodded. Together they stood in silence, two souls among the living, waiting for whatever might come next. Elliot accepted his fate, his new existence as a spirit lingering between the realms of the living and the dead. He began to take comfort in his interactions with the other ghosts, finding a strange kind of companionship with those like him. But one night, as he wandered through the city, he encountered a ghostly figure he hadn't expected. A young woman, standing in the doorway of what had once been his favorite bookstore. It was her, Emma, the woman he had loved in life, who had left him just weeks before he'd moved into his apartment. Her face was twisted in pain, her form faintly translucent, her eyes wide with terror. "Emma," he called out, his voice echoing in the empty street. Her eyes met his, filled with desperation. "Elliot, I need you! Please, help me!" The shock of seeing her was overwhelming. He reached out, trying to touch her, to comfort her, but his hand passed right through. Panic filled her gaze as she spoke, barely more than a whisper. "Elliot, don't you understand? You're not dead. I am." The truth hit him like a thunderbolt. He was alive, but trapped in a sort of in-between state, his mind unable to accept her death. His reality had twisted itself, trapping him in a limbo that mirrored death, making him think he was the one who had died. As Elliot grappled with this new revelation, a sudden, blinding flash of light tore through the street. A voice, calm but filled with authority, called out to him, "Elliot, it's time to come back." He turned, feeling himself pulled between two worlds. The spirits he'd known now seemed to watch him with a mix of sadness and hope, as though they knew he was leaving them. But Emma, she still looked at him, her hand outstretched, her eyes pleading. "Please don't leave me," she whispered, tears glistening in her ghostly form. Elliot stood there, torn between his life and her, between waking up or slipping forever into the shadows. As the light grew stronger, he took a shaky step forward, caught in the agonizing decision of whether to stay with her spirit forever or to return to a life without her. Just before he reached the light, he looked back one last time, his heart wrenching. The mansion had been abandoned for decades, but everyone in town knew the legends. Built by a 19th century eccentric, rumors claimed he had made a pact with something dark, trapping the souls of the innocent in a labyrinthine maze of mirrors in his basement. Locals spoke of the maze as a place of unimaginable horror, where one's darkest secrets and twisted desires came to life in ghastly reflections. Those who entered either never returned or came back, changed. Jordan, a paranormal enthusiast, had heard enough stories to be intrigued. He gathered his friends, Ava, Kyle, and Rachel, for an exploration of the fabled mirror maze. "This is going to be the kind of night people remember," Jordan boasted as they stood outside the crumbling mansion. But as they crossed the threshold, an unnatural cold washed over them, and Jordan's confidence wavered. "Let's stick together," he muttered. "This place is way creepier than I thought." Descending into the basement, they found the entrance to the mirror maze. The dim light from their flashlights barely cut through the inky blackness that seemed to cling to the mirrors. Shadows morphed and shifted as they moved deeper into the maze, where each corridor led to more endless reflections. Soon, Rachel felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. She caught a glimpse of her reflection, but something was wrong. The reflection was staring at her with hollow, bloodshot eyes and a grotesque grin, the lips stretched too wide as though torn open. "Guys, my reflection just moved on its own," she whispered, fear clawing at her voice. "Oh, don't be ridiculous," Kyle chuckled, but even he looked uneasy. The maze wasn't just made of mirrors. As they walked, they realized that certain patches of glass were covered in what looked like faint, bloody handprints smeared across the surface. Ava paused to inspect one of them, but when she touched it, the blood spread like a fresh wound across the glass, seeping through the cracks as though the mirror itself was alive. Her flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows as the blood dripped down, staining the floor. Ava stumbled back, her breath coming in short gasps. "This isn't just some stupid haunted house," she whispered. "There's something alive in here." Then came a voice, cold and whispering, from somewhere deep within the maze. "Feed us!" Jordan froze. "Did you guys hear that?" The voice returned, louder this time. "Give us your flesh!" A grotesque reflection of Ava appeared in a mirror beside her, and as she looked closer, the reflection's skin began to peel back in thick, bloody sheets, exposing raw muscle and sinew underneath. Suddenly, their reflections began to mimic their worst traits in disturbing ways. Kyle's reflection grinned with jagged teeth, his eyes black pits oozing blood as he whispered, "I'll be your worst nightmare, Kyle. I know every fear, every sin." One by one, each of them was haunted by their doppelgangers, who taunted them with painful truths. Ava's reflection hissed, "You never wanted to come here, did you? Just waiting for a reason to abandon them all, as you always do." As they tried to flee, the mirrors shifted, creating a maze that led them back to their reflections, no matter which direction they ran. The reflections became more disturbing, peeling back layers of skin, their flesh twisting and distorting into unrecognizable horrors. Blood pooled and trickled through cracks in the mirrors, dripping to the floor. Rachel began to cry, and her reflection laughed. "The only way out is through me," it whispered, pressing a hand against the glass. Rachel felt her own hand begin to burn as a red welt appeared, mirroring her reflection's gesture. "Rachel!" Jordan screamed. But as he reached for her, he realized that his reflection too was pressing against the glass with a wicked grin, ready to pull him in. The maze wasn't merely haunted, it was a sentient, malevolent force that demanded sacrifice. The reflections continued to torment them, revealing secrets and twisted desires they had hidden from each other, taunting them to the breaking point. Ava, in a fit of desperation, pounded her fists against a mirror, shouting, "What do you want from us?" Her reflection leered, "Blood." In an instant, the mirrors shattered, fragments slicing through the air. A shard embedded itself in Ava's arm, cutting deep. But when she tried to pull it out, her hand was stuck, her reflection laughing from within the mirror, pulling her arm deeper into the glass like quicksand. "Help!" she screamed as her hand was pulled further in. Blood smeared the glass as her arm vanished inch by inch until her reflection reached out and dragged her fully into the mirror, her screams echoing as she disappeared, leaving only bloody handprints on the glass. Horrified, Jordan, Kyle, and Rachel realized that the maze demanded a flesh offering to let anyone escape. The reflections were vessels of past victims, cursed to drag others into the mirror world for eternity. "I'm not going to die here," Kyle shouted, shoving past Jordan. But the maze twisted again, blocking his path with more mirrors. Kyle's reflection appeared in every direction, laughing hysterically as blood poured from its mouth. "Run all you want, Kyle," it taunted, "but there's no way out." Desperate, Kyle grabbed a shard of broken mirror and slashed at the reflection, but as he did, his own throat burst open, blood spraying across the glass. His reflection mirrored the movement, grinning as it bled out, dragging Kyle's lifeless body into the glass, leaving nothing but a bloodstain on the floor. Only Jordan and Rachel were left. The walls of the maze seemed to pulse, dripping with blood and flesh, a grotesque parody of life. Everywhere they turned, the mirrors mocked them, whispering promises of freedom if they'd just give in. Jordan turned to Rachel, desperation in his eyes. "One of us has to stay behind. It's the only way out." Rachel backed away, horrified. You're suggesting I stay? We don't have a choice, Rachel. It's either one of us or both of us." As Jordan moved closer, Rachel felt her own survival instincts kick in. She grabbed a shard from the ground and slashed at him, shouting, "I won't die here!" But as the blade made contact, she felt her own flesh rip, blood pouring from a wound that had appeared on her own body. She screamed, realizing that the maze mirrored every violent act, every betrayal. As Rachel lay dying, the maze revealed its final, horrifying truth. Her reflection morphed into someone familiar, her own mother. She realized, with chilling clarity, that her family had been bound to this cursed place for generations, each one pulled in and trapped by the mirrors. "You were chosen, Rachel," the reflection whispered, smiling with blood-stained teeth. "A family sacrifice. It's the only way to keep the curse at bay." With her last breath, Rachel watched as her body was absorbed into the mirror, her image forever trapped in the glass, screaming silently. As Jordan stumbled out, the maze sealing itself behind him, he realized he had inherited the curse, doomed to lure others into the maze to feed the mirror's endless hunger. Jordan's hands trembled as he traced the instructions written in spidery ink on an ancient parchment, the letters smudged and reeking of mildew. He had spent weeks tracking down every person who had ever survived the mirror maze, each one a ghost of themselves, hollow-eyed, mumbling warnings to never look back. But no one had answers. No one but the old man in the shack outside of town, a recluse who had sold Jordan this piece of cursed parchment with the instructions to sever the maze's hold on his soul. The ritual was simple, but the cost was steep. He needed another person to offer to the maze in his place. Jordan's reflection in the cracked mirror he'd set up for the ritual sneered back at him. Dark, swirling eyes glittered with a hunger that he recognized but could not explain. It was as though the maze itself was alive, pulsing with malice, waiting for him to complete the deal. "Do you really think you can free yourself?" his reflection taunted, mouth twisting into a cruel grin. "Once marked, you're one of us. We are part of you now." He shook his head, his heart hammering. "This ends tonight," he whispered, more to himself than to the mocking apparition in the mirror. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was his sister Emily who had come into town to check on him. Jordan's stomach twisted as he realized she was the easiest option, the person he could lead to the mirror maze without much explanation. She'd follow him, worried and trusting, completely unaware of the horror awaiting her. He swallowed hard, trying to shake the guilt from his mind. It's either her or me, he thought, wrestling with the despair and fear clawing at his insides. One last sacrifice and I'm free. When Emily arrived, she barely had time to hug him before Jordan's grip tightened, leading her toward the edge of the town where the abandoned mansion loomed. As they entered, Emily's face twisted with unease. "Jordan, why did you bring me here?" He forced a smile. "Trust me, I need to show you something." Her brow furrowed. "This place is wrong." She glanced around, shivering. "It's colder than outside. Are you sure about this?" Jordan's mouth went dry. He could barely look at her, every nerve screaming for him to abandon the plan and flee. But the maze's mark itched, burning like fire across his wrist, pushing him forward. His vision blurred and he felt his reflection grin in the corners of every darkened glass. He wasn't sure who was in control, him or the maze's curse. "Come on, it's just through here," he muttered, leading her toward the room with the ancient, tarnished mirror, its frame carved with writhing figures that seemed to move in the dim light. Emily hesitated, her hand slipping from his. "Jordan, I think we should leave." He bit down on his lip, summoning every ounce of resolve. It's the only way I can explain everything," he whispered. The lie tasted bitter, but he forced himself to continue. "Just trust me." She took a shaky breath, eyes full of uncertainty, before nodding and stepping closer to the mirror. "What now?" But before he could answer, the mirror began to ripple, pulling her reflection closer, distorting her face into something twisted, a mockery of her real self. Emily screamed, eyes wide in terror as she watched herself transform, her reflection showing her mouth widening, teeth sharpening, eyes hollow and dark. "Jordan! What is this?" she shrieked, trying to pull away, but the mirror had begun to emit an invisible force, drawing her in as though it had become a gaping, hungry maw. I'm so sorry," he whispered, voice trembling. But even as he felt his own horror, he couldn't look away. His reflection beside her sneered, delighted, as though Jordan's torment was the true sacrifice. Emily clawed at the glass, her hands leaving bloody streaks as she fought to resist. "Jordan, please," she sobbed, terror and betrayal in her eyes. "Don't do this, help me." But something twisted inside him, something dark and remorseless. The maze's curse, a part of him now. He reached out, placing his hand against hers on the glass. With that touch, her fate was sealed, and her body jerked as the mirror claimed her, pulling her deeper with a sickening squelch. Her mouth opened in a silent scream as her skin stretched, warped, absorbed into the mirror until she vanished. The mirror stilled, leaving only a faint smudge of blood as a reminder that she had ever existed. For a moment, there was only silence. The weight of what he'd done crushed him, but the mark on his wrist faded, cooling, its lines softening like a fading bruise. He'd paid the price. He was free, or so he thought. As he turned to leave, he felt a chill behind him. The mirror's surface rippled again, and he glanced back, dread twisting in his gut. There, in the mirror, stood Emily, but not the sister he remembered. Her eyes were dark, hollow, and filled with hatred. She stared at him, her face smeared with blood, her mouth stretching in a furious, silent scream. "Jordan!" her voice echoed, though her lips did not move. "You'll never be free." The mark on his wrist flared to life again, searing his flesh. He screamed, clutching his arm, as Emily's figure leaned closer, pressing her bloodied hand against the glass. Her eyes glittered with something dark and ancient, something that belonged to the maze. "Now," she whispered, her voice dripping with malice, "it's your turn." The reflection laughed, and he saw his own face merging with hers, becoming part of the maze, bound to it for eternity. And as the last light faded from the room, the mirror claimed another soul. Think twice before you look away, or the maze might just find you. If you made it out alive, Hit like, share, and subscribe. But remember, in this story, it's never over. More chilling tales await. Join us if you dare. When Hannah accepted a pet-sitting gig in a remote neighborhood, she thought it'd be an easy job. She'd be watching Daisy, an elderly Labrador, for a family out of town. But right after they left, she noticed an older man, her neighbor Mr. Thompson, watching her from his window with an unsettling intensity. "Be careful in there," he warned one day as she took Daisy outside. Strange things happen in that house. The way he said it made Hannah shiver. Every day Mr. Thompson appeared to tell her more about the family in the house. "You know, they're not as normal as they seem," he'd say, hinting at dark secrets with a strange glint in his eye. One night, as she was about to lock up, she heard a soft creak behind her. She turned to see Daisy standing rigid, eyes fixed on the doorway, growling. "What is it, girl?" Hannah whispered. Then she heard it, footsteps echoing in the empty hallway, growing louder. Her heart pounded as she grabbed Daisy and backed into the corner. Is someone there?" Her voice trembled in the silence. The next day, determined to find answers, Hannah explored the house, eventually finding a locked door leading to the basement. She managed to force it open, revealing a dark, musty room with boxes and dusty furniture. In the corner, she found an old photo album, its pages filled with photos of the family and Daisy as a puppy. But in the background of every photo, she noticed something chilling, a shadowy figure standing behind the family, its face blurred. What is this?" she whispered, feeling cold fingers of fear wrap around her heart. At that moment, she heard Mr. Thompson's voice behind her. "That's their little secret." Mr. Thompson continued to share his unsettling knowledge. "They brought something into that house, something that doesn't belong here." Hannah stared at him, unnerved. "What do you mean? They had a daughter who went too far," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Daisy's not the only one who's watching you." That night, Hannah lay in bed, tense and unable to sleep. Every sound made her jump, her mind racing with fear. And then, in the middle of the night, she heard a soft scratching at her door, followed by Daisy's low growl. In desperation, Hannah checked the attic the next day and found more disturbing newspaper clippings. They detailed the family's past, a daughter who had mysteriously vanished after dabbling in the occult. The articles hinted that Daisy might have been more than just a pet to the daughter. She was a kind of guardian, tasked with keeping the spirit at bay. Hannah ran to Mr. Thompson, frantic for answers. But when she knocked, his door swung open, revealing an empty, dusty house that looked abandoned for years. She asked a neighbor, who looked at her in horror. "Mr. Thompson," the neighbor said. "He died 20 years ago. He was suspected of, well, harming the family's daughter." The realization hit her like a punch. "But he's been talking to me every day." Terrified, she returned to the house to grab her things and leave. But as she reached the doorway, she heard a familiar voice from behind her. "You're not leaving, are you, Hannah?" She spun around to see Mr. Thompson standing there, his face twisted with a cruel smile, his eyes darker than shadows. "You're part of this now." Daisy began barking wildly, snapping at the figure. Hannah screamed, backing away. "This can't be happening. You're dead." With a mocking laugh, Mr. Thompson stepped forward, his form flickering like static. "No, Hannah, you are." In an instant, everything went black. When she awoke, she was lying in the basement, bound and cold. But there was no one there, just the echo of Mr. Thompson's laughter and a newspaper clipping by her side with her own face on it. Local pet sitter goes missing. Years later, new families moved into the neighborhood, and the rumors began again. Sometimes the sound of a barking dog was heard in the night, and a ghostly figure, known to neighbors as Mr. Thompson, would appear was often seen standing in the window, watching the street with a sinister smile, his eyes glinting as if daring anyone to enter. Emma's first impression of the old Victorian house was how silent it was. Mrs. Calloway, the elderly homeowner, had asked her to watch her black cat, Midnight, who had an odd habit of staring at empty corners, his green eyes tracking something invisible. "Just take good care of him," Mrs. Calloway had said, a strange look in her eye. "He's my only family now." On the first night, Emma noticed Midnight acting strangely. The cat would stare at the corners, his back arched, growling softly. At one point he hissed and backed away as though something was coming closer. "Easy, Midnight. There's nothing there," she whispered, trying to calm him. But deep down, she felt it too, a cold, lurking presence. Around midnight, Emma heard a faint creak. Midnight froze, his eyes locked onto the doorway. "Did you hear that too?" she asked, heart pounding. Midnight only hissed, never taking his eyes off the darkness. The following night, Emma was woken by the sound of footsteps slowly pacing in the hallway outside her door. Midnight sat up beside her, his eyes wide, fixated on the door. "Hello, is someone there?" she called, clutching her phone, her heart racing. The footsteps stopped. Then she heard a soft whisper, close, like it was right next to her ear. "Emma." She nearly dropped her phone, her breath caught in her throat. Midnight jumped off the bed, hissing at the corner of the room. By the third night, Emma was on edge. Midnight had started to behave erratically, often yowling and swatting at the air, and she could feel the presence growing stronger. The lights flickered, and a cold breeze swept through the room. Midnight's gaze darted toward the corner, his fur puffed as he growled low and steady. The temperature plummeted, and she could swear she saw a faint outline, a shadow lingering in the corner. "I'm here to protect you," came a faint voice, almost like a whisper from the shadow itself. "From what?" Emma asked, barely able to speak. The voice didn't answer, but Midnight hissed louder as if warning her. Emma searched the house the next day, desperate for answers. In the attic, hidden behind some dusty boxes, she found an old photograph. A young woman with piercing green eyes, eerily similar to Mrs. Calloway's. On the back, it read, "Lydia, 1980. She returned downstairs, clutching the photograph. Mrs. Calloway was waiting in the living room, her face pale. You found her, didn't you?" Mrs. Calloway asked, her voice trembling. "Who is she?" Emma whispered, feeling the chill creeping up her spine. "My twin sister Lydia," Mrs. Calloway replied, her gaze fixed on the photograph. "She was killed here by something, and she's been watching over Midnight ever since." Emma agreed to stay one more night, hoping to help Lydia's spirit find peace. But as soon as darkness fell, the presence returned, stronger than ever. Midnight started yowling, his eyes wild, as a chilling wind filled the room. The lights flickered, and suddenly the voice was there again, echoing in her ears. "Get out! You're not safe!" Emma felt something brush against her arm, a cold, bony hand. She screamed, backing against the wall as the shadow moved closer. Midnight leapt between her and the shadow, yowling louder than she'd ever heard. Suddenly the figure came into focus, and Emma realized with horror that it wasn't Lydia's ghost at all. "I'm not Lydia," the shadow whispered, a twisted smile forming as its face came into the light. "Lydia didn't survive, but I did." Emma fled the house, Midnight clutched in her arms. She never returned, but she later discovered the truth. Mrs. Calloway's sister had been something far darker, a malevolent entity that had taken Lydia's life but stayed hidden, feeding on the fear of those who remained. Midnight, who had witnessed it all, was her only protector. Years later, Emma sometimes thought she saw the shadowy figure out of the corner of her eye, a reminder of the night she came face to face with the invisible guest and barely escaped. Story 3. The Midnight Visitor, a disturbing pet-sitting encounter. "It'll just be you and Max," Mrs. Riley said with a warm smile as she handed over the keys. "He's a gentle dog, but he gets nervous alone." Lily agreed to house-sit for the weekend. The Rileys' large, isolated home was a bit eerie, but she couldn't pass up the extra cash. Max, their old golden retriever, had a watchful, almost unnerving stare, especially as he followed her every move in the empty house. Lily curled up on the couch watching a movie when Max suddenly growled, his gaze fixed on the front window. She froze, heart racing as she turned to look. A figure was standing outside, just beyond the light, perfectly still. "Hello?" she called, barely a whisper. No answer. The figure just stared, unmoving. Her phone was in her hand, but she couldn't bring herself to dial. After what felt like an eternity, the figure backed into the darkness and vanished. The second night was even worse. At midnight, she heard soft footsteps in the hallway outside her door. Max whined, pressing against her leg as the footsteps approached, stopped, and then resumed, inching closer. "Who's there?" she stammered, gripping Max as he growled softly. The footsteps stopped, and a scratchy whisper echoed through the closed door. "I'm closer than you think." Her heart raced as the door handle rattled. She held her breath, praying it was locked. Unable to bear it any longer, she dialed 911. As she described the situation, the lights flickered out, plunging the house into darkness. The only sound was her rapid breathing, and then the slow creak of the front door. "I know you're here," the voice called softly, sending chills down her spine. She huddled in the closet, clutching Max, who whimpered as footsteps grew louder and closer. She squeezed her eyes shut as she heard the intruder's ragged breathing just outside the closet. Finally, she heard sirens approaching. A loud voice yelled, "Police, show yourself!" But when she emerged, the intruder was gone. Officers searched the house, but no one was found. All they discovered was a single note on her bed. Lily moved out the next day, but the incident haunted her. Several months later, she received a call from a detective investigating a string of break-ins. "Did you know Mrs. Riley?" he asked gravely. "Yes, I pet sat for her." "Well, she didn't live there alone," the detective explained. Her brother, who'd been in hiding due to some mental health issues, was using the attic as his own space. He'd been there for months, watching over whoever stayed. Lily's blood ran cold. She remembered the noises, the notes, the feeling of being watched. As she hung up, she felt something cold brush her arm. She turned, gasping at the sight of a face in the window, vanishing before she could scream. "I told you I'd see you again," a voice whispered, lingering in the air. Hannah had been looking forward to a quiet week pet-sitting in a quaint countryside house. Her main responsibility was taking care of Max, an older German shepherd with a gray muzzle and watchful eyes. Max had a calm demeanor, but every now and then his ears would prick up and he'd stare intently at something beyond her sight. One evening, while making tea, she glanced out the kitchen window and froze. There, in the darkened yard, a figure stood beneath a tree, just on the edge of the property line. They were dressed in black, their face obscured, but Hannah could feel their gaze fixed on her. "Hello?" she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. The figure didn't respond, only watched in eerie silence. When she blinked, they were gone. The next morning, Hannah found something strange on the doorstep. A small, carved figurine of a dog that looked just like Max. The carving was weathered, as though it had been left outside for years. She showed it to Max, who sniffed it and then backed away, growling softly. "Where did this come from, boy?" she murmured, unsettled. She looked out over the yard but saw no sign of the figure from the night before. As dusk fell, Max grew restless, pacing back and forth. Then as Hannah checked the windows, she saw it again. The same shadowy figure, this time closer, just beyond the gate. Her heart raced as the figure raised a hand and pointed directly at her. "Who are you?" she shouted, gripping the windowsill. But there was no response, only silence. That night, Hannah couldn't sleep. Max lay by the bed, his ears alert, watching the door as though expecting something or someone. Around midnight, a scraping sound echoed through the house. Hannah bolted upright, her pulse hammering in her ears. She crept toward the window, peeking through the blinds. The figure was back, now standing right by the front steps, staring up at her window. She stifled a scream, backing away as Max began barking furiously, his hackles raised. "Stay away," she whispered to herself, clutching her phone in her hand, but the figure remained, motionless and watching. In a surge of panic, she ran to the door and threw it open, Max bounding ahead of her. But outside, the figure had vanished, leaving only muddy footprints trailing away into the woods. Hannah finally decided to call the homeowners, explaining the strange events. The woman on the phone went silent for a moment. Did you say a man in black?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Yes," Hannah replied, and he left a carved figure of Max on the doorstep. The woman sighed, sounding defeated. "Years ago, there was a man who used to live in the area. He claimed that Max's soul was special, a guardian of sorts. He was obsessed with the idea, said he could see something in Max that no one else could. He disappeared. But maybe he's come back." "What do you mean, a guardian?" Hannah asked, a chill creeping over her. I don't know," the woman admitted, "but be careful. He believed Max held the key to something dark, something he wanted." The next night, Hannah locked all the doors and windows, determined not to let the figure get any closer. Max stayed by her side, growling softly as though sensing the danger. At midnight, the scratching began again. This time it was more frantic, like someone was clawing at the door. Hannah's heart thundered as she approached, peering through the peephole. The figure was there, mere inches from the door. His face, hidden beneath a hood, was pale and hollow-eyed, an intense hunger gleaming in his eyes. "Give him to me," the man rasped, his voice muffled through the door. "He doesn't belong to you, he's mine. Go away," she screamed, clutching Max close as he barked and snarled. But the figure didn't budge, only continued scratching at the door with long, bony fingers. Desperate, Hannah ran to the back of the house, Max by her side. But as she turned to check behind her, she realized the truth. The figure wasn't after her, he was after Max. As she knelt to comfort the trembling dog, she saw something glinting in his eyes, something ancient and unearthly. It was as though Max's very soul was a gatekeeper to something beyond. The man's words echoed in her mind, "He doesn't belong to you." With a horrible realization, Hannah understood that Max was more than just a dog. He was a vessel, a link to the other world, and the man outside was determined to unlock it. As dawn approached, Hannah made a choice. She grabbed Max's leash, opened the door, and called out. "If you want him, come get him," she shouted, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. The figure emerged from the trees, his eyes gleaming with victory as he approached. But as he reached for Max, the dog lunged, teeth flashing. A blinding light exploded from Max's eyes, illuminating the yard. "No!" the man screamed, recoiling as though he were burning. The light intensified until he was forced to retreat, stumbling back into the darkness, his figure dissolving into the night. Days later, the homeowners returned, and Hannah handed over Max with a heavy heart. As she left, she looked back to see the dog watching her, his eyes still holding that glint of otherworldly wisdom. She never saw the figure again, but sometimes, in the dead of night, she'd hear a faint scratching at her own door, as if something was still searching for her, still trying to unlock what it had failed to claim that night. When Lucy took a pet-sitting job for a talking parrot named Coco, she thought it would be a fun, easy gig. The house was old, filled with antiques, and Coco, a large, colorful bird with a cheeky personality, seemed friendly enough. "Hello, Lucy," Coco chirped on her first night. "Lucy, watch out," he added with a laugh, though there was nothing to worry about. He even mimicked footsteps down the hall, which Lucy found amusing at first. But on her second night, as she was getting ready for bed, Coco repeated something unsettling. "They're coming, Lucy." "Who's coming, Coco?" she asked, a chill creeping down her spine. Coco simply tilted his head, blinking slowly, and remained silent. The next morning, Lucy woke up to find Coco's cage door wide open, and Coco was gone. She scoured every corner of the house, calling his name, but the silence was heavy, the house unnaturally still. On the floor beneath the cage, she noticed something strange, a trail of feathers leading toward the basement door. She shivered, remembering that the homeowner had specifically told her not to enter the basement. "Stay out," they'd warned. "It's dangerous down there." But where else could Coco be? Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Every time she turned, she thought she saw shadows flitting in the corner of her eye, and at night, she could swear she heard Coco's voice echoing faintly through the house. "Help me, Lucy," the voice whispered one evening, faint and trembling. She followed the sound to the basement door, which now seemed to emit a low hum, as though something on the other side was waiting. Her fingers trembled as she tried the doorknob, but it was locked tight. That night, she found an old, torn-up notebook on the kitchen counter that she was certain hadn't been there before. It was filled with strange scrawls and drawings of a parrot, Coco, alongside unsettling phrases. He sees them. The door must stay closed. They won't let him go. Lucy reached out to the homeowners, but there was no answer, only the eerie quiet of the house. Desperate, she researched the history of the house and found a disturbing story. Years ago, the previous owner had kept a parrot named Coco, who had gone missing under suspicious circumstances. Rumors swirled that Coco had seen something he shouldn't have in the basement and vanished soon after. The stories claimed that the bird had been able to mimic the voices of people who hadn't spoken to him directly, voices from somewhere else. On the fifth night, Lucy awoke to the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from below her room. They were slow, dragging, and seemed to be coming from the basement. Gathering her courage, she decided to open the basement door. She descended slowly, her flashlight casting long shadows on the cold stone walls. Then, faintly, she heard Coco's voice echoing from the depths of the room. "Help! Lucy, please!" Following the voice, she turned a corner and froze. There, in the center of the basement, was Coco's cage, but it was twisted and rusted, as if it had been there for years. "Lucy." Coco's voice echoed again, but it sounded distorted, hollow. Then she heard another voice, one she didn't recognize, a whisper from behind her. He saw too much. Lucy spun around, but the basement was empty. The door to the basement suddenly slammed shut, leaving her in darkness. Panicked, Lucy tried the door, but it was locked. As she banged on it, desperate to escape, she heard Coco's voice again. "They're here, Lucy. They've always been here." Then she heard laughter, a mix of voices, human and parrot, mocking her in the dark. In her terror, she noticed a faded inscription on the wall, almost like a warning. "Leave what you find. Do not bring back what's lost." In the shadows, she saw a faint, eerie outline of Coco perched on a ledge, but his eyes weren't the gentle ones she'd seen before. They were dark, almost human, watching her intently. "Goodbye, Lucy." Lucy, still locked in the basement, managed to get her flashlight back on. The beam flickered over strange scratch marks along the walls as though something or someone had clawed frantically at the stone. Just above the twisted cage, she noticed a series of photos pinned to the wall, yellowed with age. They were of Coco, perched on people's shoulders, different people. All of them had the same terrified expression, looking over their shoulder as if something unseen was looming behind them. But then, Lucy's flashlight illuminated something she hadn't expected. A photo of herself, taken from outside the house, showing her holding Coco's cage from her first night. Beneath it, scrawled in smeared ink, was a message. She's seen it too. A whisper filled the room, and this time it wasn't Coco. "You're part of this now, Lucy." She backed away, her heart racing when she heard the sound of flapping wings. Turning, she saw Coco, but he looked different. His feathers dull and his eyes dark, almost predatory. He opened his beak, and in a voice that sounded half human, half parrot, he said, "We can never leave." As she backed away, a cold hand gripped her shoulder and she screamed as the light went out, leaving her in total darkness. And then, silence. Weeks later, a new pet sitter arrived at the house, greeted by the same seemingly friendly parrot named Coco.